The wire gleamed under the relentless Texas sun that afternoon in mid-June of 1945, strung taut between wooden posts that marked the boundaries of Camp Swift. Beyond those barriers, men who had crossed an ocean as enemies of the United States stood watching something they could scarcely believe. American soldiers moved among enormous cuts of beef, each piece larger than what most of these prisoners had seen in their entire lives, turning the meat over beds of glowing coals that sent hickory-scented smoke curling into the cloudless sky. Children darted past the fence line clutching cones of ice cream that dripped in the heat, glass bottles of cola sweating in their small hands. The German prisoners, men who had been raised on a steady diet of propaganda about American weakness and poverty, found themselves confronting a reality that contradicted everything their leaders had promised them. How could any nation, especially one locked in a global war, treat captured enemies with such casual generosity? The question hung in the air as thick as the barbecue smoke. The confusion began long before that summer day in Texas. It started with words printed in European newspapers during June of 45, headlines that screamed about German women held as prisoners of war in America. The reports sparked curiosity mixed with alarm, painting pictures of scandal and impropriety. But the truth, buried in military records and camp documentation, told a completely different story. The United States had not brought shiploads of German women across the Atlantic. The vast majority of prisoners were men, hardened veterans who had fought under Rommel in the scorching deserts of North Africa, soldiers from Wehrmacht divisions captured when the Axis collapsed in Tunisia. Yet the false story persisted, carrying its own power precisely because it was wrong. The world anticipated seeing barbed wire camps filled with suffering and privation. What actually unfolded on American soil was something far more unsettling to the Nazi worldview, a display of abundance, dignity, and meals that defied everything these soldiers thought they understood about their enemies. The correction of that misconception matters because it reveals something profound about the entire experience. A sensational lie promised spectacle and outrage. The mundane truth offered something more dangerous to totalitarian ideology. Between 1943 and 46, the United States absorbed more than 425,000 German prisoners of war. These men were distributed among camps scattered from the rocky coast of Maine all the way to the sun-baked plains of Texas, kept under careful watch, yet treated according to the stipulations of the Geneva Convention. More significantly, they were fed properly, clothed adequately, and frequently integrated into the rhythms of everyday American civilian life. The gap between what they expected and what they found became the real story. For many of these Germans, the reality proved far more shocking than any rumor about women behind wire fences. The irony cut deep. The Reich had constructed its entire mythology around images of decadent, failing democracies. German soldiers received warnings about American corruption, about poverty masked by propaganda, about food shortages supposedly worse than anything in Germany. One diary confiscated from an Afrika Korps soldier on the Tunisian battlefront contained a stark warning that the Americans starved their own population while flooding the world with lies about prosperity. Within mere weeks of surrendering, those same soldiers found themselves biting into portions of beef so massive they looked more suited to feeding entire platoons than individual prisoners. This narrative transcends simple discussions of menus and camp rations. It speaks to a battle fought not with rifles and artillery, but with brisket and bottles of Coca-Cola. It demonstrates how daily exposure to genuine abundance could accomplish what no leaflet or propaganda broadcast ever could, systematically dismantling the certainty that Nazi indoctrination had built. One prisoner later remembered his shock at watching Americans casually discard things that Germans would have treasured, even fragments of bread crust, potato peelings, or rendered bacon fat. That shock represented the first fracture in an ideological wall that had seemed unbreakable. Understanding how a barbecue in Texas could become a weapon in democracy's arsenal requires following these prisoners back to their beginning, to the desert sands of North Africa, to the surrender that stunned the world, and to the long, crowded convoys that carried them across the Atlantic. What they witnessed during those journeys, and what awaited them afterward, would overturn everything they believed they knew about the enemy and about the war itself. When May of 43 arrived, the dust settled across Tunisia as columns of exhausted German and Italian soldiers trudged into captivity. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's celebrated Africa Corps had fought with determination, but supply lines had been choked off, fuel had disappeared, and Allied forces pressed forward with overwhelming numbers and material. Within a matter of weeks, nearly 275,000 Axis troops laid down their weapons. It ranked as one of the largest mass surrenders of the entire war. Many of these men anticipated execution, or at best, brutal forced marches under the merciless desert sun. Instead, they were loaded into trucks, given water to drink, and informed they were being transported to a destination that seemed beyond comprehension. They were going to the United States of America. The journey began at Algiers, then Oran, ports that swelled with liberty ships. These steel workhorses of American industrial might had been designed to haul cargo across oceans, tanks and grain and fuel through waters patrolled by German U-boats. Now, in a paradox that even the American sailors found surreal, they ferried human cargo instead. Tens of thousands of prisoners moved across the Atlantic each month. Between June of 43 and the war's conclusion, upward of 30,000 German prisoners made that crossing every single month. Bunks were crammed into cargo holds, barbed wire was rigged across deck spaces, and guards armed with carbines paced narrow aisles between the men. The smell became unforgettable for those who made the voyage. Salt spray seeping through steel hatches mingled with sweat, damp wool uniforms, and the sour tang of seasickness. In those cramped spaces below deck, prisoners whispered to each other in disbelief. One kept a diary where he scrawled that they were being sent to America, the supposed land of milk and honey according to their Führer, though his tone dripped with sarcasm. But doubt gnawed at them. Even in those holds, food trays arrived with portions that seemed unimaginable compared to what they had known in Europe. Bread that was soft and white, actual meat, even butter. One soldier later recalled that on the ship he ate better than he had at any point during his time at the front. He did not know what to make of it. Above deck, the Liberty ships steamed in organized convoys, escorted by destroyers, trailed by vigilant eyes scanning the horizon for periscopes breaking the surface. U-boat packs still hunted in those waters. The prisoners listened to the steady throb of engines, heard the thud of depth charges being rolled into the sea, felt the eerie silence that followed when no explosion came. Every thump reminded them that their lives now depended entirely on the enemy's navy protecting them from their own submarines. The irony was impossible to miss. German soldiers were being fed by American cooks, protected by American sailors, carried to captivity aboard vessels produced by the very industrial arsenal their leaders had dismissed as weak and inefficient. The voyage itself became an education in scale and capability. The prisoners counted ships whenever they could see them, sometimes dozens, occasionally more than 100 vessels moving in coordinated lines across the ocean. They watched cranes unloading cargo at Algiers, then reloading supplies destined for Europe. Numbers whispered through the decks carried an impossible claim that the Americans were completing one Liberty ship every 3 days. To men from a Reich being systematically bombed into rubble, it felt like standing inside an endless factory, witnessing a machine that simply could not be stopped no matter what was thrown against it. Yet in those dim, swaying holds, another paradox began to grow. The guards were not cruel or brutal. They shared cigarettes with prisoners. They spoke casually about baseball games back home, about wives and sweethearts waiting for them, about farms in Kansas or sawmills in Oregon. For many prisoners, it marked the first hint that their enemies were not the monsters shown in propaganda reels, but ordinary men wearing ordinary uniforms doing ordinary jobs. One prisoner remembered the sound most vividly of all. The metallic clang of mess trays as food was served echoed through the hold. That sound, he said years later, was America to him. It meant he would eat. It meant he would survive. But the true revelation still waited ahead. Norfolk waited with its massive docks, warehouses stacked to the ceiling, and the first real glimpses of what America looked like up close. From the sea to the soil, these prisoners were about to learn what genuine abundance meant. When June of '43 brought the Liberty ships gliding into Norfolk's harbour in Virginia, many German prisoners were getting their first actual sight of America. Cranes towered above the docks like steel giants, warehouses were stacked with goods of every description, train lines hummed with locomotives pulling endless cars, and most striking of all, there were no ruins, no rubble, no shattered buildings or broken glass scattered in the streets. To men who had departed from bombed-out cities where destruction had become the landscape, it felt as if they had arrived in an entirely different world. The disembarkation proceeded briskly, but in an orderly fashion. Prisoners shuffled down gangplanks under guard, their boots clanging on the steel, and what immediately struck them was not hostility or anger, but efficiency and organization. Lines of trucks waited in neat rows. Red Cross officers stood nearby with clipboards. American soldiers carried paperwork instead of pointed rifles. It felt more like arriving at a factory than at a prison, one soldier recalled later. Everything moved with precision, and everything seemed to be available in endless supply. Processing began immediately with medical inspections. Doctors in clean, pressed uniforms, stethoscopes hanging around their necks, checked blood pressure, examined teeth, listened to lungs. Many of the prisoners, hardened by months of desert fighting, assumed it was merely a pretext for humiliation or worse. Instead, they were told their weight, informed of their deficiencies, given honest assessments of their conditions. Military records from the period show that the average German prisoner arriving at Norfolk weighed between 25 and 30 pounds under his expected healthy range. Nearly 1 in every 5 men displayed clear signs of malnutrition: night blindness from vitamin deficiency, bleeding gums indicating scurvy, rashes from pellagra, weakness suggesting beriberi. The paradox hit with crushing force. Men who had fought believing themselves the elite warriors of Europe were suddenly revealed, in cold medical terms, as underfed and physically fragile. Then came the blow that none of them had anticipated. Rations arrived, hot food, not crusts or scraps. Milk poured freely from pitchers. Bread was soft and white, not black and gritty like the war bread back home. Meat appeared in portions so generous that the men initially suspected some kind of trick or staged performance. One recalled waiting for cameras to appear, expecting to be told this was all for show, but no one came. The food was absolutely real. In the processing camps, the menu followed standard army fare: scrambled eggs, fried potatoes, beef stew thick with vegetables, and coffee, gallons and gallons of coffee. To prisoners accustomed to ersatz grain beverages or chicory substitutes, the aroma of genuinely roasted coffee beans was intoxicating. Diaries captured their profound disbelief. "Even their own soldiers surely do not eat like this," wrote a corporal from Bremen. But they did. American soldiers ate this well every single day. The psychological weight of these meals cannot be overstated or underestimated. German propaganda had spent years painting America as a hollow giant, a country barely able to clothe or feed its own citizens properly. Yet here, the enemy was not only feeding its soldiers well, it was feeding its prisoners nearly as well. One doctor's report noted that within weeks of arrival, the average prisoner's weight increased by 10 to 12 pounds. The report added a curious observation that morale appeared confused, with prisoners laughing as they ate, then falling silent afterward, as if afraid the food would suddenly be taken away from them. The processing centers also brought first glimpses of American abundance in everyday items that went beyond food. Prisoners saw warehouses stacked impossibly high with crates of fruit, tobacco, even chocolate. They watched trains roll past constantly, each car filled with grain or coal or machinery. The sheer scale of it unsettled them profoundly. "We did not understand how they could possess so much," recalled one sergeant, while simultaneously fighting a war across the entire world. Smells lingered in their memories long afterward. Diesel fumes from the locomotives, pine tar from the docks, and above everything else, the constant, inescapable aroma of food being prepared. To step off a ship half-starved and immediately breathe in the scent of roasting meat and baked bread was to feel, in one overwhelming sensory rush, the collapse of an entire worldview that had been carefully constructed over years. But Norfolk represented only the beginning of their education. Ahead lay long train journeys pulling them inland through landscapes completely untouched by war. Fields green with growing corn, orchards heavy with ripening fruit, towns where shop windows gleamed with goods available for purchase. If Norfolk had cracked the facade of Nazi propaganda, the journey deep into America's heartland would smash it completely to pieces. From the Norfolk docks, the prisoners were herded onto long lines of railway cars, their windows barred but still open to let in air. The clatter of steel wheels on tracks began the next chapter of their captivity, a journey across the American interior that proved more astonishing for many than the food they had already received. The train surged westward, passing through Virginia's Shenandoah Valley. Out the windows lay rolling orchards heavy with apples not yet harvested, fields carpeted with green alfalfa, barns painted bright red and white like something from a children's storybook. The men pressed against the glass, whispering to each other in amazement. Not a single bomb crater, not one ruin, one prisoner remembered thinking. For soldiers who had left behind smoking German cities where entire neighborhoods had been reduced to rubble, the sight of intact towns with whole roofs and children playing safely in streets was a paradox almost too great to bear. The sounds defined the memory for many. The whistle of the locomotive echoing across hills and valleys, the steady rattle of tracks beneath their feet, and in between those sounds, the laughter of American families who waved as the train passed through towns. Sometimes children ran alongside the tracks, tossing chewing gum or pieces of chocolate through the bars of the windows. A corporal from Cologne later wrote that he had not seen an actual chocolate bar in years, and a child casually gave him 2 pieces, and he felt ashamed that the enemy's children had so much to spare. As the train rolled deeper into the south, the true scale of America became unmistakably clear. Endless miles of farmland stretched in every direction. Cornfields extended all the way to the horizon. Cattle grazed peacefully behind sturdy fences. Irrigation ditches glistened under the sun. To men who had grown used to ration cards and constant shortages, the abundance proved staggering. The United States was not only feeding its massive army deployed overseas, it was feeding millions of people at home, and apparently still had enough surplus to waste. One prisoner muttered to another, "If they can accomplish this, if they can maintain this level of production, how can we possibly ever win this war?" By late summer of '43, many of these trains converged on Texas. There, in the baking heat, construction crews had raced to raise entire cities built from wood and wire. One of the largest was Camp Swift, located near Bastrop, completed in barely 4 months of frantic construction. The camp sprawled across thousands of acres, with seemingly endless rows of barracks, guard towers positioned at intervals, kitchens, workshops, and even a fully equipped hospital. By autumn, it held approximately 5,000 German prisoners within its boundaries. Camp Swift embodied the American paradox in physical form. It was a prison, yet it looked to the prisoners more comfortable than the barracks they had left behind in Germany before the war. Electric lights glowed at night throughout the compound. Hot water poured readily from taps. Latrines flushed with the simple pull of a handle. Each barrack building had stoves for winter heating, fans for summer cooling, and mess halls that served 3 hot meals every single day without fail. It was as if we had entered a modern world we had been repeatedly told did not exist anywhere outside Germany, said one soldier. The sensory impressions of Texas seared themselves into memory. The air smelled of mesquite smoke and dust. Cicadas droned incessantly in the heat, and evenings glowed with smoke from cook fires drifting lazily across the prairie. At first, the prisoners remained wary, expecting harsh discipline and brutal treatment at any moment. Instead, guards spoke casually to them, sometimes even joking around. They issued uniforms, bedding, soap, and calmly told the men that work assignments would come soon enough. The paradox tightened its grip on their understanding. Here they were as prisoners, yet treated with more dignity and material comfort than they had known as supposedly free men living under the Reich. They were captives behind wire, but they slept on mattresses actually stuffed with cotton and ate portions of food that left them feeling genuinely full. One diary entry recorded the confusion perfectly, stating that they were behind wire, but in their stomachs, America felt more like freedom than captivity. Then came the moment that crystallized all this confusion into a single, unforgettable experience. The invitation to participate in an American ritual completely unlike anything that existed in Germany. The summer barbecue. It was here, gathered around pits filled with hickory smoke and sizzling brisket, that their perception shattered entirely and irrevocably. July 4th of 1944 arrived at Camp Swift in Texas. The sun blazed white in a cloudless sky, cicadas rattled endlessly in the trees, and the smell of wood smoke curled above the wire fences. For the German prisoners, the date itself meant absolutely nothing. It was simply another day spent in captivity, indistinguishable from the one before. For Texans, however, it was Independence Day, and celebrations always meant food, music, and communal gathering. By late afternoon, an extraordinary paradox unfolded before their eyes. Prisoners were marched out under guard and were about to witness a feast that defied every single lesson that had been drilled into them by the Reich's propaganda machine. Rows of cooking pits lined the open ground, each one dug shallow into the earth. Inside these pits, hickory and mesquite coals glowed brilliant red, sending smoke rising sweet and sharp into the air. On metal grates positioned above the coals, massive slabs of beef brisket, some weighing 12 to 15 pounds each, hissed and dripped fat that sizzled dramatically when it struck the glowing embers below. The air carried complex layers of scent that built upon each other. Black pepper, paprika, garlic, and the dark, rich sweetness of brown sugar rubbed into the meat's surface. For men long accustomed to watery stews and coarse rye bread, the aroma alone proved overwhelming to the senses. A local rancher named Buck Morrison, broad-shouldered and deeply sunburned from years of outdoor work, lifted the lid of a steel smoker and speared a massive cut of meat with a long fork. The bark on the outside was crisp and dark, the smoke ring glowing pink just beneath the crusty surface. He laughed as he displayed it proudly to the watching prisoners. 12 hours, he announced, his voice carrying easily across the gathering, slow and steady. That's exactly how you do it right. The Germans simply stared, some of them shaking their heads in disbelief. No one cooks meat like this for prisoners, one whispered to another. Yet here it was, undeniably real, and meant for them. Alongside the brisket came large trays loaded with side dishes, cornbread crumbling golden and still warm from the oven, beans that had been simmered for hours with molasses until they were thick and sweet, potatoes baked until their skins split open, glass jars filled with pickles and large bowls of coleslaw crisp with vinegar dressing. Children darted between the tables, carrying glass bottles of Coca-Cola that hissed when opened, sold for 5 cents at any store but given away free on this particular day. The prisoners watched as American families piled their plates high, laughing and singing, even offering food directly across the invisible barrier that separated captor from captive. A teenage girl quietly slipped a generous slice of peach cobbler to a stunned sergeant standing near the fence. He wrote about it later in a letter that was censored but preserved. I immediately thought of my younger sister standing in a queue for bread in Hanover, he wrote. And here these people give dessert freely to the enemy. The music struck them next, washing over the gathering. Fiddles and guitars, the lonesome wail of a harmonica, Country tunes rolled out across the prairie, mixing with the sharp pop of firecrackers and the constant hum of voices in conversation. Some prisoners found themselves clapping along to the rhythm, uncertain and embarrassed by their own response. Others deliberately turned away, unwilling to show any emotion that might be interpreted as weakness or gratitude. But all of them felt the same crushing weight of contradiction, the impossibility of being fed like honoured guests while simultaneously confined as enemy captives. Numbers reinforced the shock of what they were witnessing. In Germany at that very moment, ration books strictly limited civilians to 2 pounds of meat per week, and often they received considerably less than that amount. Here, in a single meal on a single evening, men were being offered more meat than their families back home might see in an entire month. Briskets weighing 15 pounds each were being roasted by the dozen. Hundreds upon hundreds of pounds of beef were consumed in a single evening's celebration. "This is not propaganda or a staged display," murmured a camp physician named Wilhelm Huffman. "This is their daily life, their normal existence, and it systematically destroys everything we were told about America." The taste lingered in their mouths and memories long afterward, smoky and rich and impossibly tender. Brisket sliced thin with juices soaking into soft white bread. A corporal from Stuttgart recorded his experience in his diary that night. "I could not sleep," he wrote. "I had eaten so much that I felt physically sick. But more than simply full, I was profoundly confused. Why do they feed us so generously? We killed their sons on battlefields, and still they give us meat and kindness." That night, as fireworks cracked and bloomed above Bastrop and the prisoners lay in their bunks trying to process what they had experienced, the memory of barbecue smoke still clung to their clothes and hair. For many of them, it represented the first truly undeniable proof that America was not the land of poverty and collapse their leaders had described in such vivid detail. The enemy had revealed its true weapon, and that weapon was not brutality or deprivation, but rather generosity and abundance freely given. And yet, this was only one dramatic encounter on one special day. The deeper shock, the one that would prove more lasting and transformative, would come not at holiday feasts and celebrations, but in the steady, unremarkable rhythm of daily life that followed. In canteens where they could purchase goods, in payslips that gave them spending money, in small luxuries that prisoners never expected to hold in their own hands. For all the memorable spectacle of a 4th of July barbecue, it was actually the daily rhythm of ordinary camp life that astonished the prisoners most profoundly. What they saw day after day, written into printed menus, stamped onto payslips, handed over in the form of small tokens and privileges, made abundantly clear that the abundance of America was not some holiday exception staged for propaganda purposes, but rather the ordinary, unremarkable pulse of the entire country. Breakfast established the pattern immediately. Prisoners awoke each morning to the familiar clang of mess hall bells and discovered trays set with eggs prepared in various ways. Scrambled, fried, sometimes boiled, served alongside oatmeal sweetened with actual sugar, toast spread thick with real butter and substantial slices of bacon. Coffee flowed freely from large urns, dark and hot and strong, not the bitter substitute made from roasted acorns that had become standard across Germany. "To have genuine coffee every single morning," wrote one prisoner originally from Munich, "was more luxury than our generals enjoyed at home." Lunch and supper reinforced the shock with relentless consistency. Beef stews thick with vegetables and chunks of meat, fried chicken with crisp seasoned batter, loaves of fresh white bread baked on site in camp kitchens, pies filled with apples or cherries or pumpkin, depending on whatever season it happened to be. Peanut butter, sticky and sweet and strange to German palates, became a particular subject of fascination among the men. One diary noted with brutal honesty that at first it disgusted him completely, but then he found he could not stop eating it once he acquired the taste. Even potato chips, a snack food invented only a few decades earlier, appeared regularly in the camp canteens where prisoners could purchase goods, and then came the matter of pay, which shocked them almost as much as the food. Under the Geneva Convention's clear stipulations, German prisoners were entitled to fair compensation for their labour. In American camps, this meant receiving tokens or scrip that could be redeemed at the camp canteen for various goods. With these earnings, men could buy cigarettes, candy bars, soap, shaving cream, writing paper, and to their continuing amazement, bottles of Coca-Cola chilled with actual ice. A sergeant originally from Bavaria wrote in a letter home that he sat in the shade one afternoon, drinking a Coca-Cola while listening to a radio broadcast, and he thought to himself that this simply could not be what captivity was supposed to feel like. The raw numbers shocked them every bit as much as the luxuries themselves. The United States Army allotted prisoners of war nearly the same rations as it provided to its own soldiers, approximately 3,500 calories per day, compared rather starkly to German civilian rations that had dipped below 1,500 calories by late '44. Where German families queued for hours just to purchase a few ounces of butter, prisoners in America spread it thick on white bread without a second thought. The disparity gnawed at their consciences. Guilt mixed with disbelief, envy tangled with gratitude, all of it combining in an uneasy emotional mixture that kept them awake at night. Even entertainment entered the picture in ways they never anticipated. Camps offered libraries stocked with American novels, German classics, and even works by Goethe available in translation. Film nights screened Hollywood pictures, westerns and comedies, sometimes carefully selected war films that avoided giving offence. Music drifted constantly across the wire. Swing records played on gramophones. Church choirs sang on Sundays. Even visiting bands performed occasionally. Prisoners were allowed to form their own orchestras, perform theatrical plays, or paint elaborate murals on the walls of barracks buildings. For many of them, the luxury that cut most deeply was simply a measure of freedom of movement within the camp boundaries. Yes, barbed wire surrounded them. Yes, guards with rifles patrolled the perimeter at regular intervals. But inside that wire, men could walk freely through fields, tend vegetable gardens they had planted themselves, even play competitive soccer matches before crowds of cheering spectators. In some locations, they were hired out as labour to nearby farms or sawmills, riding in trucks past astonished local residents who saw enemy soldiers waving at them like ordinary workers headed to their jobs. One guard remembered a Texas farmer telling him plainly that those German boys worked harder than the local boys he actually paid wages to. The contrast to what they had imagined before capture was absolutely stark. Germany's propaganda apparatus had promised them a decadent America collapsing under severe rationing, a desperate place of soup lines and crippling shortages. But the well-stocked canteens, the regular payslips, the readily available Coca-Colas, and the steady supply of butter and meat told a completely different truth. The daily shock was not found in fireworks and special feasts, but rather in the casual, almost thoughtless abundance that characterized ordinary life. One prisoner managed to sum it up perfectly in a letter that was censored but carefully preserved by authorities. If this represents their normal life, their everyday existence, then we have been lied to far more deeply than we ever knew or imagined possible. And yet, the most startling encounters were still ahead of them. Not within the confines of the camps where reality could perhaps be controlled and staged, but outside those wire fences, when prisoners walked American streets under escort but unshackled, and saw with their own eyes the genuine prosperity of ordinary towns going about their ordinary business. By the middle of 1944, something truly extraordinary began to happen across America. German prisoners who had once braced themselves mentally for punishment and starvation now found themselves boarding trucks, not to labour under heavy guard in hidden quarries or punishment details, but rather to ride directly into American towns. Their destinations were farms that needed harvest labour, factories short on workers, sawmills requiring strong backs, and sometimes even civic projects building roads or infrastructure. The paradox was absolutely plain for anyone to see. Men who had marched into this war as would-be conquerors were now serving as labourers in the very heartland of the country they had been taught from childhood to despise and underestimate. The sights that greeted them astonished every man who made these journeys. Instead of ruined cities or desperate breadlines staffed by starving citizens, America revealed itself through neat rows of houses with freshly painted porches, markets overflowing with goods of every description, and children peddling bicycles with baskets full of fresh fruit balanced on the handlebars. A prisoner originally from Hamburg recalled with perfect clarity walking past a grocery store window early one morning in Kansas. There was more meat hanging in that single shop window, he said, than could be found in all of Hamburg combined in an entire month. I genuinely thought it must be a dream or hallucination. The numbers alone bore out the enormous scale of this labour programme. By 1945, more than 200,000 prisoners of war were actively employed as labourers across the United States, contributing an estimated 45 million man-days of work to the American economy during the war years. They picked cotton under the hot sun in Texas fields, harvested wheat across the endless plains of Nebraska, felled towering pines in the forests of Arkansas, and built roads stretching across the Midwest. Payment came not in actual dollars, but rather in canteen coupons that could be exchanged for goods. Yet even these simple coupons represented riches compared to what awaited their families struggling back home in bombed cities. The paradox of perception deepened with every trip outside the wire. These were enemy soldiers who had fought to destroy America, yet they were greeted with civility and sometimes even with genuine kindness from civilians. Farmers invited them to sit under shade trees to drink lemonade during breaks from fieldwork. Church groups brought sandwiches and cookies. In relatively rare cases, they were even offered home-cooked meals at family tables. One woman from Minnesota later recalled the memory clearly. "They looked so terribly young and so tired," she said. "My mother simply couldn't help herself but give them bread with jam. They thanked her as if she had given them gold instead of simple food." But the shock carried another layer beneath the surface kindness. The prisoners had fully expected hostility from civilians. Perhaps stones thrown at them, curses shouted, or angry glares from people who had lost sons and husbands to German bullets. Instead, they encountered Americans who were not starving, not beaten down by deprivation, but rather thriving in ways they had been repeatedly told were impossible under democratic systems. They were driven past cornfields that stretched farther than the eye could see in any direction. Grain elevators rose like towers on the horizon. Freight trains rolled past that seemed to have absolutely no end, car after car after car loaded with goods. The irony proved cruel in its intensity. While they marvelled at this plenty surrounding them, letters from home painted increasingly desperate pictures of want and suffering. Rations in Germany had dropped below 1,200 calories per day for civilians by late 45. Cities lay in utter rubble from relentless bombing campaigns. Winter fuel was desperately scarce. Children fainted in school classrooms from simple hunger. Yet here in America, prisoners rode through prosperous towns where bakeries casually tossed unsold loaves of bread at closing time, where children bought ice cream cones with spare pennies found in their pockets, where backyard barbecues flared up on weekend evenings as if war did not exist. The cumulative effect proved deeply disorienting to men raised on propaganda. "We saw no poverty anywhere, no hunger, no despair of any kind," one Bavarian prisoner later admitted in an interview. "What we saw instead was a land that lived as if the war did not touch it at all." It was precisely then that I realized with complete certainty that everything we had been told our entire lives was simply a lie. Still, suspicion lingered stubbornly in some minds. A few prisoners whispered among themselves that it must all be an elaborate show, that perhaps the Americans had carefully staged this abundance specifically for their eyes, that beyond the routes they travelled lay hidden poverty. But each trip outside the camp boundaries confirmed exactly the same reality without variation. Markets remained full of goods. Factories continued operating at full capacity. Towns stood completely untouched by any bombing. Families lived their lives without evident fear or deprivation. Even the smell of the air itself told the story. The scent of gasoline at filling stations, grilled meat wafting from backyards, fresh bread emerging from bakeries. These were smells that told of a life that simply could not be faked or staged on such a massive, consistent scale. The shock of those excursions beyond the wire proved greater and more lasting than any feast or barbecue celebration could ever be. Behind barbed wire, one might reasonably suspect illusion or propaganda. On American streets, watching ordinary life unfold, one simply could not deny the overwhelming truth. The abundance was not propaganda or performance. It represented the ordinary, unremarkable rhythm of daily life for millions of people. And yet, as the war ground inexorably toward its conclusion, and Germany itself lay increasingly in absolute ruins, the prisoners understood with growing certainty that their extended stay in this land of plenty could not last forever. Soon enough, they would be loaded onto ships once more, carried back across the Atlantic, returned to a shattered homeland, to cities barely functioning, to families who could scarcely imagine or comprehend what their sons and husbands had witnessed during their strange captivity. By late 1945, the Great Reversal finally began in earnest. Trains rumbled once more across America, but this time carrying not men arriving fresh from distant battlefronts, but rather prisoners being assembled and prepared for the journey home. From collection points, they were transported to ports where convoys of Liberty ships waited to ferry them back across the Atlantic Ocean. Only this time, there existed no mystery whatsoever about what awaited them on the other side of that voyage. Germany was decidedly not the land of plenty that propaganda had described for so many years. It was instead a wasteland of bombed cities, hollowed factories standing empty, and ration cards that promised more food than could possibly be delivered. The contrast between their departure from America and their arrival back in Germany proved absolutely heartbreaking for most men. In America, a prisoner might have eaten 3 eggs for his breakfast, washed down with coffee and a full glass of fresh milk. In Hamburg or Cologne, his family considered themselves fortunate to share 1 single egg among 4 hungry mouths. In the camp, he had purchased Coca-Cola and chocolate bars with his canteen script whenever he wished. At home, his children waited in long lines for turnips or watery soup made from whatever could be found. It was like falling directly from heaven into hell, one prisoner recalled upon first stepping back onto German soil and seeing the devastation. Statistics bore out their despair with brutal clarity. By 1946, the average daily ration available in occupied Germany had fallen below 1,000 calories, sometimes dropping as low as 800 in the British-controlled zone. Malnutrition spread rapidly, especially among the young and the elderly who were most vulnerable. Black markets thrived as the only way many families could supplement official rations. For men returning from a land where even prisoners had been fed steaks and pies regularly, the shock of return proved almost unbearable psychologically. A diary kept by a former prisoner who had been held in Nebraska recorded his feelings upon reunion with his family. "My wife looked so much older than I remembered," he wrote. "My children were thin, their cheeks hollow. I could not find words to explain to them that while in prison I had eaten better and more regularly than they did in what was supposed to be freedom. And yet, amid all the guilt and the grinding hunger and the despair of return, something else lingered persistently in their minds and memories. A clear recollection of what they had seen and experienced. They had lived for years in a functioning democracy that treated its enemies with basic decency and humanity. That had allowed prisoners to earn fair pay for their work. That had permitted them to read books freely, to play soccer, to taste barbecue at national holiday celebrations. They had seen with their own eyes supermarkets overflowing with goods. They had witnessed farms operating efficiently without shortages. They had observed ordinary civilians living their lives without constant fear of bombers overhead or secret police at the door. The paradox crystallized completely in their minds now. They had come to America as conquerors in their own minds, believing themselves to be masters of a decadent, crumbling nation that would collapse easily. They departed humbled and transformed, utterly convinced that America's greatest weapon in the war had not been its tanks or planes or bombs, but rather its abundance, its ease of life, its ordinary prosperity that seemed almost magical to men from a totalitarian state. One veteran managed to sum up the entire experience perfectly in an interview conducted decades later. "We were defeated twice," he said simply. "First by their armies on the battlefield, which was expected. Then by their entire way of life, which we never saw coming." Some of these men carried this profound lesson directly into the work of rebuilding Germany from its ruins. Former prisoners returned home with a completely new respect for democracy, for fairness in governance, for the genuine possibilities that peace could offer. Historians examining the post-war period have noted repeatedly how the prisoner of war experience became a quiet but remarkably real influence in the process of German reconciliation with the West. They saw a possible future, one scholar wrote in Analysis, because during their time in America, even as captives behind wire, they had actually lived inside that future and experienced it firsthand. The story of German prisoners of war held in America during the Second World War is not ultimately a story of cruelty or intentional deprivation, but rather one of sustained paradox. Enemy soldiers arrived expecting chains and punishment, and instead found Coca-Cola and kindness. They anticipated rations of crusts and scraps, and discovered barbecue feasts that seemed impossible. They expected propaganda and carefully staged deception, and found instead daily truth written plainly in calorie counts, in payslips, in overflowing markets that could not possibly be faked. In the end, after the war concluded and years passed, the barbed wire rusted away completely. The camps were dismantled and emptied. The men returned to their lives, but the memory endured in ways both personal and historical, and with it came a lesson that echoed across the decades that followed. America's true might lay not only in its bombs or its factories or its military, but equally in its ability to show an enemy a fundamentally different kind of power. The power of genuine plenty freely shared. The power of freedom exercised daily. The power of ordinary life lived without fear or want. When everything else was stripped away and examined carefully, America's greatest weapon in that conflict had not been its capacity for destruction, but rather its seemingly endless capacity for abundance, generosity, and the quiet dignity of treating even enemies as human beings deserving of basic decency and adequate food.